I was mainly stunned for about a week after that. And once again, a gigantic mute bruiser, in nuclear green and purple, handed me a bag with money and drugs, and said to let them know when I felt good to come back. Dave did not respond to my text during this time, and Debbie just told me to rest up, and to tell her when I could come in because she didn't want to talk about it over the phone. I began to rack my mind for experiences or situations that I could at least Google. It was difficult to tell which parts were Florida and junkie mythologies, and which came from people reacting to something genuinely weird, whether they had their facts straight or not. Everyone used to say that the area that is now Bryant Park and the expanse of Lake Worth was deeply haunted. Bryant Park is an incredibly beautiful suburban park on the Intercoastal Waterway. It borders Lake Worth, a formerly poor neighborhood that still has really bad parts and rough roads, but has been increasing in value thanks to older homes, which are frequently easy to renovate, thanks to concrete block construction. It's a beautiful old neighborhood, with a distinct style formed out of the blocky homes and frequent use of pastel colors. It used to be a great place for the homeless to crash, as Lake Worth used to be a lot cheaper. It still is, but not as much. If you were out at the park at night, you had to be careful, because things that looked like people would occasionally come out of the water in the summer, and for some reason, only the summer. They'd turn and face the seawall that lined the walkway, with their backs to the park, and wait for people to get close to them. When someone did, they would see something that looked almost human, but with giant mouths filled with large, blunt teeth, oddly shaped eyes, stringy wet hair, and slimy, pale skin. There had been plenty of missing homeless from that area, and every now and then, the area underneath the Lake Worth Bridge, which crosses the Gulfstream Hotel and goes over the park, was sealed off by the police, who had presumably found something. It was absolutely agreed upon that the Gulfstream Hotel had a man living in it, despite being boarded up for who knows how long. He would stare angrily down at passerbys, and if you tried to get his attention or willingly made eye contact with him, he would motion for you to come up to him. I've never met anyone who went past the first flight of stairs and went any further, though, as that creepy old building was built with the old Floridan rule of air conditioning. Make it as drafty as possible, and preferably out of wood, even in places it shouldn't be. This made it creaky, and therefore creepy. This also meant the wind screamed throughout the building. But I remember one guy named Andy, who is now a physician, who told us that it sounded like a person whistling something. I remember a girl I went to John I. Leonard, and later dropped out with. Megan Water, an adorable long-haired brunette who was into Radiohead and who I used to score weed from. She started dating some older guy on the island. I remember this because the cops came around asking the people on her phone and text history if anyone knew his name or what he looked like. The top part of her head, missing the bottom jaw, had been found hanging from her hair, from a streetlight near Dentura, which was a largely desolate street at the time near Clematis Boulevard. Clematis is a tiny, pathetic strip of ever-changing clubs and restaurants across the water from the island. They've made it a hell of a lot nicer these days. I heard Megan Water tried to break up with her old creep boyfriend, and was really afraid because he wasn't who he said he was. One of the worst rumors was that he demanded that she marry him so that they could move away together, and when she said no, something began stalking her. Her friends said she was really afraid in the days before her death. I also remembered John Parks, a stupid junkie who was into theater and a lot of drama. I never liked him, so I never paid attention to the fact that he was killed in a hit and run near the breakers. But they found pieces of him in Manalapan, which was down the ways, by a normally beautiful 20-minute drive. They found those pieces months after he was killed. Some of the stories about how they died were pretty horrific, and I thought they were just cruel high school bullshit at the time. I remember hearing that John Parks was seen screaming and trying to get someone's help the night he died. waving to people from across the Royal Palm Way, from the path that leads to the Flagler Museum. But when they caught up with him, it was someone else, who claimed they hadn't seen a thing. Some of the stories didn't even need a death for an origin. It was widely understood when I was growing up that the schoolhouse I would now be avoiding for the rest of my life was, in some way, haunted. I had never really paid attention to that, but I remember Stimpy, a kid from high school who was an idiot, a basket case, and obsessed with occult stuff. In that order, unfortunately. He had insisted that not only was the place deeply haunted, but that Hobe Sound had even worse things. Weird ghosts who wore insanely colored masks, and hunted humans or made bargains with them. I can't remember all of what he said, but I've been Googling it and can only find bits and traces. I remember him telling us about people made out of sand who would try to imitate humans, and a demon that haunted the Wellington Green Mall. As I said, it's pretty difficult to tell which parts had any inspiration that was genuine, because most of it was bullshit. There were urban legends about Native American spirits that still haunted the land, dead slaves and other victims of Flagler who kept looking for revenge or solace, and other, stranger spirits that had less clear definitions. Jessica, the blonde who was hired by Dave to run our medication room, mentioned something about reading up on that stuff. She came from Hobe Sound, and got interested in missing persons reports when a girl in her high school went missing. A lot of people were contacted by the girl who went to school, and who had apparently spent her last moments trying to contact someone to get help. They claimed she said she was horribly wounded by something that came out of the sky, and was afraid that it was hunting her. I'm still looking for any bits left on the internet about that. Her friends posted something on Facebook because they felt like the cops ignored what they told them about the girl's last phone call, and decided that she probably just ran away. Still, I had no idea which of these stories were even based on truth, and even then I really doubted their accuracy. The people I hang around couldn't be expected to report what color the sky is accurately. Aside from the deaths, I wasn't sure there was any truth at all to them, but I did want to avoid the Lake Worth area from now on. After about 4 days, I left my car in the shop and Googled my own name to see if I had a warrant for running over a kid. Nope, not a single thing. I almost hoped I would get stopped by a cop, just to see if anything came up. The suspense made it hard to focus. After I got my car window fixed and the vehicle detailed, I started to pay a lot more attention to the patients and the weird stories they always told. I had previously, sadly, assumed these things to be bullshit, but there was no chance that my employers hadn't heard the same stories. Did Dave or Debbie or George know what they were sending me into? I knew I had to confront Dave, who seemed higher on the totem pole than Debbie, about what exactly he knew. I wanted to gather more information. It seemed like everyone around me knew of a vast system of weird shit that I had only yet seen the edges of. Debbie knew to get the fuck away from that bird thing. Dave knew that the creep with a bolo tie, whose name I really hoped was Lyle, because at least that would consolidate the sources of creepiness, was coming and not to talk to him. And I was willing to bet there was plenty more. I needed to talk to some junkies. Dave still hadn't returned my text about talking to him one-on-one, but now that I was back at work, I was certain he would come around soon, and I needed more to ask him about. Most of the junkies wanted nothing to do with anyone, since they were quietly but openly committing a felony. But some of the miscreants, who came in smaller, less regular groups, that were cut off from the herd, were chattier. They were always more than happy to talk, especially since I worked for the people who handed them pills. The amount of people involved in moving these pills up what was called the Blue Highway was absolutely staggering. Tens of thousands of people were directly involved in driving from Appalachian states to Florida in order to procure drugs to resell at home. Middle-level dealers recruited low-level junkies of all stripes to go down to Florida, and many of these people were impoverished, uneducated, frequently mentally ill, white trash. The runners usually came from trailers that were little more than tin shacks for homes, or dilapidated homes left over from an era where people in that area could afford to build them. At home, it wasn't rare for them to go without electricity, and sometimes even running water, but they always managed to get their pills. Some of them went missing from time to time. I heard dozens of weird stories pretty much right away. The most consistent definitely involved a man wearing the bolo tie. I asked some regulars who were there at the time about him. A fat old couple from Ohio with more track marks than arm skin. The balding old man in camouflage, and his wife, who, I shit you not, came in wearing a bright orange muumuu with brilliant flowers. Henry and Louise Tompkins. You could smell either of them from about 10 feet away. Hey, that guy with a nice get-up and the Texas tie, he ever say anything different? The old man put down his gigantic soda and looked at his wife in consultation. She nodded sagely to him, keeping her eyes fixed on me from behind her big red glasses. He leaned over to me, even though we were the only ones there. Nah, hear from someone else that he came up on some people in Jacksonville at Josh Rhodes' clinic. Kept bothering them about how to leave and where are they and whatnot. Weird fucker. He shot his wife another look, this one far more dire, and the obese old woman nodded one more time, this time only slightly. Heard he got a couple of 'em. Can't talk to him, can't say nothin'. Don't know what he looking for, always dressed the same. I heard more or less the same thing from a couple of other people. One person told me it happened in a motel, and that no one saw how he got there. Another said they were waiting in a pharmacy, but that no one said anything, and he just passed by, confused and talking to himself. They said they watched, with their own eyes, as he ignored a person of the non-junkie variety, when that good Samaritan tried to help him at the pharmacy. Of course, plenty more of the stories were clearly bullshit. Sometimes stuff they probably heard through the junkie grapevine, like him being a cop, or a member of some organized crime group or another. Sometimes they were just junkies talking in the moment, and it didn't mean anything. But there were other stories too. People were prone to going missing, and it's hard to tell which stories were just explanations for overdoses, and which ones were genuinely weird shit. I kept hearing that we should all stay away from the beaches and the parks, especially in the mornings. A lot of the people who try to sleep there overnight on the trip down to Florida simply don't make it. Even the large groups, who occasionally had their own armed hicks for security, were prone to avoiding the living shit out of the coast and driving inland, even though it was covered in police. The Everglades is a place no one would cross, and the fact that there were almost no junkie outlets in areas along the more rural southern part of the West Coast, or at least fewer of them, was taken as proof that all junkies should avoid it. This made me worry since I live on the edge of an area called Loxahatchee, all the way across the county from the Grand Island, and pretty much bordering the massive wetlands covering Florida. Miami was loudly and openly known as its opposite, and it was known for being absolutely safe for even the most absurd behavior. I kept hearing relatively consistent stories about strange people who would warn junkies about police, and at least one seemingly less batshit story, even distracting the police. They wore weird clothes and smiled great big smiles, even though I kept hearing that they didn't look happy. Despite being helpful, people were generally scared shitless of them, and they kept repeating that stuff about the mirthless smiles. One of the most infamous legends was to avoid the tourist traps and fields along the lines of the Blue Highway, I-95 for the uninitiated. Over and over, I would hear about how people would pull off the main highway into largely uninhabited areas that compose the majority of Florida and seem relatively safe. Over and over, I heard about people going missing that way. I remembered hearing about this from other junkies before, but how many times? I never paid attention to these urban legends before, but now they were suddenly becoming crucial in my mind. I wondered how many of them were truth or even just half-truths. The most frequently repeated junkie legends involved people or things coming out of the woods and leaving behind very little of whoever they found. It was always a friend who disappeared, as part of a larger group or something else distant. I noticed that people hated talking about it more than anything. I also noticed that there were no stories of single people being killed or going missing. It was always entire groups, and some exits were worse than others. A guy named Damon, pretty sure he picked that name for his fake license, had been coming around for as long as I knew, and was pretty friendly with Debbie and Dave, and had name-dropped George on more than one occasion. He came in, just after Samantha disappeared, wearing his usual Stone Temple pilot shirt and black denim jeans, seemingly almost impressive for his relative level of hygiene and the quality of the clothing and car he owned. After he checked in, and was waiting in the doctor's hall, I decided to start a conversation. "Good morning, Mr. Damon. Would you mind if I asked you a question?" "It's a free country, ain't it?" He smiled kindly from behind unreflective aviator sunglasses. "If I were driving along I-95, and I needed to stop and rest, say, off of Yeehaw Junction, an area about 30 miles away from bumfuck nowhere, where could I stop at?" He stopped, smiling. "I'd say skip an exit or two and forget whatever you thought you needed at Yeehaw Junction. Even when we go to Lake Wales, we drive around the long way." Lake Wales was a major crystal meth production center at the time, and it was close to rural spots like Winter Haven and Eustis, attracting its own narcosphere of interconnected supply workers and distributors quickly. He meant driving down the other coast, an entirely different group of operations I had no knowledge of. For so many scumbags to avoid such an obvious shortcut wasn't just unusual, it was borderline impossible. I had driven through there and slept in parking lots as a teenager all the time, with nothing to worry about. Why do that? He looked exasperated. "Less heartache." He clapped his hands to his knees and shrugged to show his lack of enthusiasm for the subject. I nodded and moved on. Eventually, Debbie asked me why I bothered Damon about it. She was gorgeous, with dark brown hair and a kind of Native American look, and a dislike for being hit on or being told to smile. She often now dressed in the frumpier version of her wardrobe, and didn't care what the patients or I thought about her appearance. When she wanted to look great, it was easy. But right now, with slightly smeared eye makeup, she looked angrier than she was. "Wilkes, I need you to tell me what you were talking to Damon about. George texted me about it." This was actually a big deal, since George was the real power, and despite sleeping in the same bed as him, we almost never heard about his wishes. I wanted to ask him about places to sleep along I-95. She stared at me with a hint of accusation. "Why?" "I keep hearing patients talk about this spot I used to camp in when I was younger, like there's something wrong with it." She sighed and thought about it for a second. I stared at her, knowing that she had some idea as to what the fuck was going on, or at least what the scale of this shit was. She glanced at the ground before meeting my eyes again. "You need to stop asking people about it. It scares them, and they might start to think bad stuff if they think you've been going there." She stared at me defiantly, but I was suddenly in no mood to concretely find out what she knew. What she knew was that the place was clearly dangerous. I took this to mean that it was widely known enough to just stay away from. Looking back on all this, I probably should have. That afternoon, before I left, a little girl who came in with what appeared to be her mother and father bounded up to me. She was wearing a little blue shirt and white pants, and seemed delighted to talk to someone after having to stay quiet to avoid the junkies for so many hours. "Hello! Me and my mommy and my daddy were coming down here, and we tried to sleep off of the Yeehaw Junction, but a man in a blue alligator mask ran up to us and yelled at us twice and bit the front of our car. You shouldn't go there." I was more than a bit stunned, and she just happily bounded off away. We were standing outside the clinic and she ran to her dad, an old man with a stained trucker hat and a gray t-shirt, who didn't look like he enjoyed the people who normally came to our clinic. He nodded to me and walked off to their car, which was missing the front bumper and had a spare tire on. Jesus fucking Christ. So if this was entirely caused by supernatural shit, there's no way I'm the only one who noticed. I stared at their car as it limped away, for once hoping they got good money for their meds. Patients overdosing became so common that the phone calls from police, demanding information on the amount of medication prescribed to the deceased, stopped registering pretty quickly. It wasn't long until someone that I genuinely knew ended up being the reason for one of those calls. Corey Franks was found today, in a ditch off of Southern, well past 441. Dead from an overdose. We're going to need all the information you have on him. The detective was blunt, fully aware that she was talking to one of the people who helped expedite this young man's death. He was a 22-year-old surfer local. Locals were rare, and he was a friend of a friend. He was definitely an idiot. One of those people who listened a lot to Sublime and talked about how it resonated with him whenever he got high. He hung out with me a couple of times, especially if I had weed, and was usually full of shit, and hung out only with people who were generally pretty awful even by white trash standards. A lot of his friends genuinely thought Insane Clown Posse and role-playing games where you dressed up as a vampire in public and really acted it out were entirely acceptable. Whoever he was with may have been the one who left the poor kid's body in a canal near the Loxahatchee Glades. Didn't even take the medication. It was all there. We're trying to find any information on any close relatives or anyone that won't hang up if we call about him. She was saying a lot more than they normally did. I wondered if she knew that I knew Corey, or if she just sensed that she could strike a chord with me. A sudden feeling of terror ripped through me, turning me cold as ice. I didn't so much think about what prison would be like as much as feel it, as if it were waiting around a corner for me. "I don't know," I stammered while looking at his file on my computer. The cheap plastic desk suddenly felt ice cold, and I was all too aware that the DEA was probably watching my every move. This phone call could very well end up in my trial. The feeling of eyes on my back made my skin crawl. I talked to him a few times, but he didn't list any contacts, and he mentioned that his dad kicked him out a year ago. I knew he had been staying with a bunch of junkies from South Carolina, who took him with them to pick up and sell their medication at a profit, and I began to search my mind for the words to use to summarize this. He was staying in a motel for an extended period of time, and we have the license plates and names of the people he seemed to be staying with. Would you mind checking to see if they are patients too? I already knew that at least one or two of the names would show up. The ringleaders who owned the cars and fronted everyone else the cash for their visits rarely stayed as patients themselves. I had no interest in exerting any energy in protecting them, and happily faxed her all of the relevant files without telling anyone. The rest of the day went by quickly, thanks to a lot of pipe hits in the bathroom and doxylamine. I said goodnight to Debbie and Jessica as the doctors filed out to their luxury cars. The moment I opened the deeply tinted glass storefront door, the feeling of eyes watching me was almost physically palpable. The sun was down and the parking lot empty aside from some homeless gathering in front of some empty storefronts. I whipped around, and in the dark I saw a beaten-to-hell 90s Buick Roadmaster station wagon. I remember it clearly because it was the one Corey used to drive. He thought it was the coolest thing in the world because he read on a website that station wagons were cool and it had a V8. The headlights weren't on, despite the sun being only a dark orange slit. It seemed to move towards me, but if it was much slower than I could easily gauge, especially in the dark. I didn't hear the threatening burble of the engine, but I got the impression it was moving towards me. I had no idea why Corey's junkie friends would swing by this place after he died, and I didn't want to find out. I avoided making eye contact with the vehicle's front windshield and opened my car door, without bothering to see if the movement I saw in the reflection on the windshield was actually something behind me. By the time I got back to my shitty one-bedroom house, in the middle of Loxahatchee, it was pitch dark and the swamp was emitting its usual deep, guttural sounds. I put on some romantic comedy that made me feel good once. I tried to envision myself as one of the characters of the movie, happy and normal, but at this point, I was just trying to remember the last time I had successfully escaped to that degree. That night, I got more fucked up than usual. I desperately chugged the remainder of a $7.50 of dirt cheap vodka. I remembered buying the expensive stuff and telling myself that I'd make it last. But I had stopped telling myself excuses a while ago. I followed this with some Xanax and a little NyQuil. I put on some headphones, tried to either get into the music or the movie, but no amount of weed could let me escape reality. I went to sleep with the TV on mute, in a desperate attempt to let some of the positive emotions from that saccharine movie soak into me. I woke, covered in cold sweat, gasping for air. It was still dark out, and colder than usual for Florida, thanks to some exceptional December winds. Despite the money I was bringing in, the only pieces of furniture in my room was a mattress on a box spring on the floor, and a desk and chair for my PC. I was desperately craving the sweet burn of booze, despite feeling deeply nauseous. If I had to guess, I was probably still drunk. I lurched up with a start, and saw something move in the dark near my door. I squinted in the dark, and suddenly, I heard my front door open. I ran out of my room in my underwear, only to see my front door wide open, and the beaten Buick on the road that ran perpendicular to my small driveway. It was facing me, as if it was about to drive directly into my front door. My home, like most in rural Florida, was hemmed in by plant life. This, combined with the flat land, ensured that you usually only see a wall of green, or a shitty strip mall when you drive anywhere in the state. The car was sitting on the road, facing my house directly, blocking the road entirely. It was the only object in my field of vision other than the woods and road. The lights still weren't on, and once again, I got the impression the car was moving. I could feel something watching me, and a sudden feeling of terror froze my spine. This time, entirely without any connotations of the FBI or jail. Whatever was inside that car was watching me. I saw something move in the air, in between the car and me, but couldn't make out what it was. I flipped on the light switch nearest to me and didn't bother looking to see if it revealed anything. I slammed the door shut and ran through the tiny concrete shack I called a home, flipping on every light and turning on the TV to full blast. As if the sound of people laughing and falling in love on that movie would somehow ward anything off. I didn't dare look directly at any window, instead catching them from the corner of my eyes to make sure the blinds were already pulled shut. I staggered into the kitchen, still fucked up apparently, and pulled a Red Bull from my fridge. The sharp taste did refresh me for a brief second. I wanted to get out of there, but I would not dare go near the door, in case something wanted to come back inside. I sat down on my couch, with my back to the concrete wall. My cell phone had a missed call from my friend Carl, who called at 1:30. It was 3:37 at that point. I called him, praying to God he wanted drugs badly enough to drive to my place right away. He didn't, but I offered some free Xanax and I could hear him putting on clothes before he ended the 16-second phone call in a confused tone. I didn't move until the doorbell rang, when I just said loudly, "Come in." I was terrified it wasn't going to be Carl. Carl looked exhausted, even for a junkie, but smiled weakly with an interested look in his eyes. I was more than happy to open my private stock, hoping to God he would try and strike up a conversation in an effort to get more drugs. I showed him the giant bottle of Soma pills I had pilfered, and he brightened right up. "That does sound good. I get horrible back spasms and, yeah." I was already pouring some out for him before he finished the excuse for his addiction, and he seemed too happy to question it. "Hey, do you have some new neighbors or something?" he asked absent-mindedly as he popped a few of the Soma. I blinked hard and tried to shake off the fear that was still with me, or at least keep it from showing. No. Why, did you see someone?" I tried, and failed, and he seemed to notice but kept going. "Yeah, when I drove up here there was someone standing in the road, staring at your house. It looked like the car had broken down because they were standing outside of it. I tried to talk to them, but they just drove off." "Them" wasn't the word I wanted to hear about right now. He seemed to think maybe my new neighbor was going nuts because he was smirking. "Are they gone?" I was pretty openly fucking terrified at this point, and Carl seemed to become concerned. "Yeah. I only saw one person for a split second, and I'm pretty sure there was someone else inside. They must have run off. Do you think it was the cops or someone following you? You could crash at my place. My mom wouldn't care." He tapered off as he was speaking, and I guess that maybe he was just offering concern as thanks for the free drugs, but I had to take it. "Yeah, that would be cool. I could sneak out before she woke up anyways." Carl's mom was 67, and suffering from a laundry list of medical issues. She took care of Carl as if he was a perpetually wounded bird, no matter how many times he stole from her. She was barely hanging on to a job where she had been quietly demoted repeatedly and offered various severance packages to retire, but she had no savings thanks to Carl, and couldn't dream of it. She was perpetually nervous and drank a lot of wine, and I hated seeing her because of the guilt I felt for giving this asshole drugs. I swallowed this and followed Carl out to his car, massively relieved to not see the Buick out there. I slept like a baby on his couch for almost 3 hours, before whatever was in me wore off, and I woke up and drove to my place for a shower. Work went by, but not easily. I told Debbie about the car that had been following me, and that it had been a friend of mine's who'd OD'd. She listened intently, and when I left her office, I heard her speaking into her cell phone with a concerned tone. Aside from the typical junkie business, it was a normal day, with the normal amount of terrible shit. Not a single human being wanted to be there, and most were disgusted with themselves for even showing up. People spat chewing tobacco into bottles of Mountain Dew and left them there. They got into fistfights over drugs in the parking lot, and a couple of girls who looked like they were ready to kill themselves waited outside near the parking lot in outfits of varying degrees of skimpiness, willing to turn tricks for pills. Eventually, I decided to finally stop procrastinating and confront Debbie. She was in her office and told me to come in when I knocked. She had an array of drugs in front of her and a laptop with a spreadsheet open. "Hey, I have to talk to you. Some shit happened on the island at that drop. And some other shit." She sighed and shut her laptop. She had clearly hoped I would dump this on someone else's plate. "I know shit went bad." She turned around to face me and motioned for me to sit in a chair across from her desk. "Listen, we got the bags, all right? You did good. Someone was just trying to fuck with you." I haven't even said what happened yet, and I'm pretty sure that it was not people who have been fucking with me. I sank into the chair and stared at my knees, while I prepared for either bullshit or something worse. I don't know what was more amazing. That she thought this was just weird people, or that they sent someone to pick up the bags later. I was worried the bags were just filled with newspaper, and that they didn't plan on me coming back. A lot of weird people are involved in this shit. They do anything to get more. We had to make the drop there, but we thought it wasn't likely for anyone to notice you, since you're kind of new. It usually takes a while before the weirdos notice you. This opened up a lot of questions, and no answers. I was already frustrated. Why did you have to make the drop there? That doesn't make any sense. And why were there weirdos there? And by the way, that is not what they were. I found myself deeply unwilling to state that rotting bird demons may have been at fault. As if saying it out loud would make all the weird shit true. As long as there was the possibility that I was mistaken, there was the possibility that it was just junkies and thieves the whole time. There's some shit going on around here that belongs on the X-Files, and I have the bird feathers to prove it. Debbie had a deeply unsettled look, and she stared down at her desk, as if reading something for a moment. We had to make the drop there. We didn't have a choice. Look, I'm going to talk to Dave when he gets back. Do you want to crash at me and George's place for the time being? If you don't feel safe, that is. She sounded sincere and a little guilty. This was good, but the idea of sleeping in the same house as her mobster boyfriend with swastika tattoos just didn't seem as reassuring as a shitty motel room or a friend in City Place, the tiny cluster of expensive restaurants in the middle of what was once a massive ghetto. I did not want her to extend that offer any more than she already did, as the thought of being in her home was more than a little disturbing. I'm alright. For now. I'm gonna crash at a room at Simon's or a motel. I muttered a thanks and a goodbye and went back to work. It was less than a week to Christmas, and the patients were as demanding as ever. My friend Simon wasn't excited about putting me up, so I said no worries, and decided to head to a La Quinta nearby that thankfully had a full parking lot. Not being in my home and not giving a shit even if there was a car outside, or a bird on the roof, because there were cameras and other people around. Somehow, I didn't think any of that weird shit would be too contagious. I finally slept deeply, and without too many drugs. Aside from some dream where I was looking for a mask in an old station wagon, I slept like a baby.